Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Iron Culture. It is me, Eric Trexler, here with the Dr. Eric Helms. This is Iron Culture, presented by the Mass Research Review. It's Monday night, 7 p.m., which means we are live. Helms, how are we doing tonight?
I'm doing well, man. We're seeing each other. I'm enjoying it. We had a good last episode, and you know what? Things are going well in mass. I'm excited about the issue that just dropped a few days back, and
Oh, yeah.
I'm
Big
almost
one.
done with my books.
Big one. Almost
Also,
done with your books. Okay.
yeah.
Do you have
Like
a date circled on the calendar?
honestly, I pretty much do because we're down to just like half of an appendix for the training book and minor modifications to the behavior and lifestyle final chapter, and then it's so I'll put it this way. End of this week is what I've got circled on my calendar for being done writing entirely. And then it'll be moving on to like making figures, discussing whether we want to release it just through Amazon this year and just send PDFs to the prior purchasers who already had the second edition. And people can get it on Kindle or like there's stuff to discuss and things to do. So it's not going to launch at the end of this week. It'll probably come out. And also, yeah, we need to have a meeting of like when's the best launch date. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's right there. And you know what? I'll be able to die a happy man after that's written. I'll tell you what.
Yeah. Is that also, you have a date scheduled for that too? Or are you just going to,
Yes,
okay.
it took me 6 years before I got so annoyed I needed to rewrite. No, 5 years before I got so annoyed I needed to rewrite this book, and I don't want to rewrite it again. So I'm thinking sometime in the next 5 years, I'm pretty happy with how my life's gone.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That's where you want to be at the end of life, is saying, you know what, I did what I wanted to do. I'm ready to go. And I feel like within that time frame, you're going to be close to, typical life expectancy anyway. So,
Yeah, and
why push it? You don't
based
need to be
upon
greedy.
I don't want to be greedy, and there's a lot of life that's out there, and I think other people deserve it more than me at this stage. And not to mention, um, I'm starting to question what my actual age is because I think I'm 42, but
Hmm.
then based upon the references that you, Zerdos, and Lauren think I will get, and also sometimes the quite like specifically stated years that I have been alive, which sometimes include the early 1900s and the 1800s, make me think that I might be 130, and it's just that I have some unique form of cognitive decline where I don't lose all memory, but I just only keep the last 42 years of memory. So I
Yeah.
think I'm 42, but I'm actually 130. And maybe I've thought I'm like, you just run out of space, and like you just kind of like your iPhone. It's like, well, I'm just going to delete your old stuff. I
Yeah.
think that's what's happening. So,
So, Helms,
yeah.
let me clue you in on something here. This is just the way the world works. I hate to be the one that has to break this to you, but you can see behind me, I don't know if I told the Iron Cult about my new background. We've got the 9 national championships for Ohio State football behind me, the 5 national championships for Duke basketball. I've had the great privilege of interacting with the basketball team a little bit here at Duke. And if you are 6'4" in that room, you are short. Okay, that is how it works. I don't make the rules. 6'4" in that room is a tiny, tiny man, and therefore, within the mass crew, it doesn't matter if you're 42 or 82. You are the oldest, which makes you the
That's
old
true.
man. You could be in a group of friends and you could have a BMI of 25.5, but if it's the lowest, you're the skinny little tiny guy, right? That's just the way it works, and there's nothing we can do about it. I'm sorry.
That's the way of the world. No, I'm
Yeah.
okay with that.
All right, but
Um,
Helms, you mentioned
yes, sir.
mass. This was a doozy of an issue. If folks out there don't have the privilege of being a member of the mass community, we got articles such as "How many calories does thinking actually burn?" Sex
Hmm.
differences exist but don't persist. Very intriguing title. Does exercise science have a replication crisis? Oh my goodness. Warming up. Big claims, little evidence. Does dieting make you more depressed? Very interesting research in that area where the observational work is quite different from the longitudinal work, which is always something I like to dig into. And then finally, don't be reclined to sitting during your rest intervals. And Helms, we
That's a
also,
good title.
oh yeah, for sure. We also had a couple videos, one from you, individualizing protein intake, the devil in the details. That was a recording from your presentation at the SNA conference this year in Texas. And then we had Mike with a video, the live journal club video, should we pre-fatigue for hypertrophy? So this was a loaded issue, and we've already selected a lot of articles for the next one coming out on September 1st, and it's going to be another doozy. So folks, we all know and love the Mass Research Review because it makes iron culture possible, but I tell you what, dig into those pages. You're going to like what you see.
No, that's I think a great way of presenting it. And yeah, we are over 100 total issues,
Crazy.
and that has over 1,000 pieces of content, which is wild. And
Yeah.
as the oldest member of Mass, I've been here for all of them, and I've forgotten most of them. So for me, it's like a new issue every month.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
And I tell you what, folks, if you're thinking, so I don't want to have this effect. Helms, I don't know if this, I don't want to ever pretend that my internal thinking patterns are at all reminiscent of how a typical human being behaves. But sometimes someone will tell me, like, hey, you should watch this show that's on Netflix or Hulu or HBO Max or whatever. And I'll go, okay, tell me more. I'm already kind of skeptical because I'm good for watching maybe one or two new shows a year, and that's it. I'm not, it's not my thing. So then they'll start telling me, so here's the plot. I go, okay, I get that. Here's the one of the main actors. Oh, he's pretty good in some stuff. But then they tell me it's in season 8 now. And I'm like, absolutely not. I don't have 8 seasons in me. I'll never catch up. I'll die before I get to the end. It's not going to happen. So I want to make sure people know when we say, listen, Mass has 1,000 pieces of content. We're always very adamant about making sure that each new article represents an update to the literature. And so basically,
Yes.
we have, believe it or not, in 1,000 pieces of content in the fitness space, we've talked about caffeine at least twice, more than one time.
Maybe even 3 times, Trex.
Perhaps, who knows? But basically, every time we address it, we try to concisely kind of say, here's where we're at, and here's what this new research adds, and here's how you would use it. And in the process of doing that, we will link back to original articles. So, for example, going with the caffeine example, as we're kind of getting you up to speed very concisely and briefly, we might mention, well, we know that, you need to take it at least this many hours before bed if you're taking a big dose. We know that the ergogenic effect itself, regardless of sleep effects, seems to be bigger in the morning versus the evening. So we'll kind of rattle off, the current state of affairs, either toward the beginning or the end. And you might say, wait a minute, I don't remember hearing anything about caffeine working better in the morning than the evening. And so then you click through there. And I think that's how a lot of people end up discovering the back catalog is they're reading the new stuff, and only when they hear something and they're like, that is something I need to dig into deeper, they start kind of expanding backwards. So do not use the Eric Trexler heuristic of if there's more than 30 minutes of material, I'm out. Because what you'll find is you will dig into the older stuff as it piques your interest. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we could have gone one of two ways. Basically, following the formulas of modern television is have a show that really, really builds upon prior episodes, gives you the recap, says, hey, this will only make sense if you remember back in season 3 how you actually found out that they were not identical twins. They were fraternal, but only the birth mother knew that, kind of like, style. Or you do the one where the characters develop, but each one is also contained on its own and captures the collective growth of all of them. And it's not like a completely disconnected episode from everything else, but it integrates everything that previously happened succinctly and in a well job. And we've taken the latter approach. So every piece of content will absolutely stand on its own, which I love. But you still will be aware of how we got to where we are. And I think we do a very good job of telling the story of science and how did the research evolve to get where we are, and then what does it mean, which I think is actually a really good way of doing it and quite engaging.
Yeah, and it's fun because we're talking about research that's in embedded within an endeavor or a sport or a pastime or a hobby or a culture that we love, and so
Hmm.
we can not only tell the story of the science, but how that science has kind of been utilized within the fitness space, and how the fitness world has influenced the science, how the science has influenced the fitness world. It does lend itself to quite, a very feasible narrative building, which I think kind of makes the medicine go down a little smoother when you're talking science, right? When you can build it into something that's tangible, relatable. Yeah. So, new issue. I almost said new episode. New issue of Mass came out a couple days ago. Check it out if you haven't yet, and we'll have another one September 1st. Helms, before we get into the good stuff tonight, I did want to ask, how is your prep going? Any updates there?
It's going well, man. I am 8 weeks outish, maybe 9 weeks, depending upon how many
Wow.
weeks are in
Yeah.
September and August. And yeah, I think it is 9 weeks because it is the first weekend in October. Um, and I am hanging around 83, a little like mid 83. So kind of body weight bounced back up a little bit after travel. I wouldn't say I had a full blown diet break, but I eased off the gas pedal a little bit. And I have actually competed in this level of condition before, but probably a good 5 pounds lighter, which is pretty cool. So that's 2-ish kilos, a little more for the Americans out there. But yeah, I'm really pleased. Like I have glute striations from the side. I've got some hammy splits and a couple from the back as well. And I'm not in the ultimately peeled condition that I will need to be at my most competitive. But I know from here, you know how it goes, Trex. Like when you are down to what is probably truly single digit body fat percentage, which I think I'm at now, small amounts of fat loss, I'm going to say not necessarily weight loss, they look disproportionately noticeable.
Yeah.
And, like every half kilo, every pound that I lose now, there are substantially more visible changes in my physique. So I'm really trying to do the thing that most competitors don't do. And we've talked about this before in your own prep and how sometimes you kind of wish you'd had a little bit of oversight. To someone to tell you, like, hey, you don't have 15 pounds to lose. And if you lose 15 pounds, it's not going to be what you want to lose. That is kind of what I have and what I'm also trying to be for myself. Like, closing the energy gap as I have less to lose rather than widening it, panicking, and sprinting to the finish when you end up actually just, sprinting off your own hamstrings, crawling to the finish and looking worse. So that's what we're doing, kind of sneaking off and letting the final layers of fat come off, which I tell you what is the final bits of fat to go that are the most stubborn, which might be a segue.
Might be indeed. But very briefly, I do want to at least get. Well, yeah. Let's go ahead. Let's follow it. I'll follow your lead on this. Let's dive into it. Because good segues, you just can't pass them up, right? You got to go with it when it's
Mm-mm.
there. So,
Got to.
stubborn fat has vexed humanity for ages. We weren't so worried about it in our early evolutionary history. More the opposite. We were trying to pack on the pounds if we could. But in modern history, there have been many a remedy to try to get some of that stubborn fat mobilized to see, what we can do, particularly in the realm of supplementation. And Helms, we recently had an interesting conversation off the air about the ECA stack. And this was a remedy people used to boost fat loss, to boost their energy.
Well, it was a conversation you and Lauren had, not off air, but on
Correct.
Front Page Fitness, which you guys are doing a great job with.
Yeah, Front Page Fitness, another podcast available wherever you get this one and on YouTube, of course. But anyway, yeah, Lauren and I were talking about it. I forget how we got onto it, but we were talking about supplements and probably supplement regulation was kind of the main theme of the topic, which has always been a fun little hobby horse of mine because there's so many misconceptions about it, and it's one of those areas where there are a lot of misconceptions and no one thinks they have misconceptions. So they make very bold
Hmm.
assertions that are fundamentally not true. Even though they're relatively true in spirit, it's a whole can of worms. Like I said, it's a hobby horse of mine. So I'm going to try to restrain myself. But one of the topics that came up was the ECA stack. And to be totally honest, just putting my cards on the table, this goes back to, the theory that Helms is a very advanced age. The ECA stack was frankly before my time.
Yeah.
This was, I think, kind of at its biggest in the 90s. Is that right?
Yep. I
So,
would say so.
so yeah, when I was 6, I wasn't all that into supplementation, other than the Flintstones multivitamin, which honestly, those were really good. And I would have eaten them if they were just a candy, no vitamins included. They were very, very good. But that was as far as my supplement knowledge went. And by the time I got really into supplements as an academic or even as someone just using them, those were kind of in the rearview mirror. And the new kind of controversial supplements were the quote unquote pro hormones that were just oral anabolics, which gave way to the kind of new sequence of semi supplement, what would you call them, stimulant products that really
Hmm.
never met the criteria to actually be considered a dietary supplement ingredient. But basically, by the time I got into all this stuff, ECA Stack was like history. So Lauren and I were talking about it, and I didn't even know what the A stood for. I knew it was ephedrine, caffeine, and something with an A. And so she came in clutch and remembered it was aspirin, but that's about as deep as we got into that conversation. And then offline, Helms, the historian, came through and told us a little bit more about aspirin, and we figured we'd talk a little bit about it tonight on the show.
Yeah, I thought it was so it's interesting because the same eras overlap a bit. So I guess if SARMs and the current controversy are to prohormones and prosteroids, probably more accurately described. Although there was a prohormone era as well. Andro was really big.
Yeah, yeah, there was.
Um, yeah, if SARMs are to prosteroids, prohormone era, what the like Jack 3D basically manipulations of meth as a compound are to another supplement, it would be ephedra and ephedrine, and the death of I think the ECA stack, it probably is directly related to um, kind of the same death of like the prohormone era, prosteroids, and people not really knowing that because there was a very similar set of actions that took place in the mid 2000s where the FDA stepped in and did some things. Um, and there was some subsequent decisions as well by organizations related to prohormones and prosteroids. There was a nebulous era where they weren't really banned, and then they were banned by sport. And then there was also the actual class three, uh, you know, classification of anabolic steroids, and then classifying these quote unquote supplements under that. That happened in 2004, got better enforced in 2006. Um, and ephedra sits in a nebulous place between all of that because it's banned by sport, but it's not necessarily illegal. But it's banned by the FDA in supplements, so it sits in
Yeah,
a unique spot.
yeah, and it's also interesting that you know, for many things in when it comes to various products and food ingredients, you expect, even though you kind of shouldn't. I think there's a natural tendency to expect some degree of uniformity. For example, if you were to go from America to Canada to the UK to
Hmm.
Australia to New Zealand, and this is one of the few that tends to be regulated a little bit differently in those that little grouping of 5 or 6 jurisdictions. So another example would be melatonin. For many years, there were a lot of areas where you couldn't get it, which as an American, or you needed a prescription, or there was just a much higher level of control. And as an American, I just couldn't fathom that because it's like anytime you go to the grocery store, you could pick out about 7 different versions of melatonin, no big deal. And Ephedra and Ephedrine products, that's definitely another one that kind of falls through the cracks and has some different regulation from place to place, which is always fascinating. But yeah, I double checked, and it looks like ephedrine alkaloids in the U.S. they were banned by the FDA in 2004. But like you said,
Yep.
they still exist in this weird little space because I do not believe, I'm quite confident they're not they're certainly not a controlled substance by any means.
No,
But they're just
no, and
something that
I can give you the history on this if you're interested.
yeah,
'Cause
yeah, go
I,
for
I,
it.
I think it's kind of cool. So, well, I say kind of cool, and then I'm like, people died. So, essentially, a couple of parallel things happened. And as is often the case in the history of supplements and drugs in the US, there is often a combination between public outrage, um, legitimate issues, and then the political will to enact a change. So, and the more you mess with things that are part of the core identity of America, the more that political will get mobilized. And if you mess with baseball, I tell you what, things are going to happen.
Yeah, and you know what? What's really odd about that is when you look back at the history from let's call it 1990 to 2005, like within that little period, supplements were a very, very political thing. Like there was
Yes.
tremendous time allocated in terms of congressional minutes when they actually get around to deliberate, legislation on the books, major overhauls of legislation. Like dietary supplements were extremely political in that time period, and like you said, it was because frankly they came into whether we're talking about steroids, pro hormones, the ECA stack, once it touches baseball in that time period, it goes straight to the Senate floor. And what's really fascinating is just how much even our culture has changed. Because I was just thinking right now, I'm not sure. I'm going to get a lot of hate for this potentially. I'm going to get a lot of hate from about 4 people, and no one else will care. If they just stop doing Major League Baseball, it'll take 2 months for America to find out. Like baseball is no longer. Doesn't have the cultural purchase it used to. But
No, it was a
nowadays,
big deal in 2000s and the
But
90s.
nowadays, if
Yeah.
something touched the NFL, it'd be again straight to the Senate floor. So that's like the only kind of thing that's really changed dramatically is this stuff still could totally ignite controversy, but I think now it has to touch football rather than baseball.
You're not wrong. Like, I think basketball, baseball, and football, they each have the rotating time in the sun. And that's been the case, honestly, since all three of those sports have become popular professional sports. And there's complexities with the NCAA, professional sport, and who is likely to win, who are the personalities, and then what's going on. But to give people a picture, like I was born in Oakland and I lived in the 80s and 90s, and this was a hotbed. Like you had the Bash brothers, Jose Canseco and Mark McGuire, and then you had Barry Bonds after that, and you had the Battle of the Bay where it was the A's and the Giants in the World Series, and then you had the '90s related big steroid allegations, and you had Mark McGuire publicly saying, "Listen, it isn't steroids. I'm taking andro and creatine," which was the progenesis of creatine being seen like a steroid and the initial phases of why the Pro-Hormone Steroid Control Act in the mid 2000s happened. And there was a similar parallel of what was going on with ephedra. So in the early 2000s, ephedra-based supplements were quite literally everywhere. And the most common one, well, I think, was like hydroxycut, which was a muscle tech fat burning agent. And ephedrine combined with caffeine was like the core staple of most fat burners. And we'll talk about the science of why. But there were big deaths that occurred, I think, in 2003 and 4. So Corey Stringer, Rashidi Wheeler, and Major League Baseball pitcher Steve Betchler, who was probably the most prominent of these deaths. I can't remember if the other two athletes were NCAA or if they were professional, but I think it was a mixture, and it was across a couple
I
sports.
think Corey
But
Stringer, if I'm not mistaken, he was early in his NFL career, maybe with the Minnesota Vikings, perhaps. But I,
that
I,
sounds right.
I remember that though, and I do know as a bit of trivia that at the University of Connecticut now there is the Corey Stringer Institute where they study a
Mm,
variety of topics related to hydration and heat stress and heat illness. So yeah,
yes, and that's an important point. Is that these deaths were essentially, there was a heat stroke related death, and it also was found that he had ephedrine in his system, or there was a unexplained death and one of these athletes had ephedra. And some people claimed, and especially those in the supplement industry, that this is just a overreaction. It reminds me of there's been a number of like bodybuilders or NFL players where at the time steroids were blamed for a violent death or a suicide or something like that. And probably more accurately nowadays, we go, oh, that might have been a TBI, or that could have been mental health, or it was at most probably a moderator rather than a causative factor. But I think what people often don't acknowledge is that doesn't often happen in a complete vacuum, and rarely have these legal decisions been purely based upon headlines. And in fact, by the time that these deaths happened, the FDA had actually been compiling evidence for actually years, and there were over 16,000 adverse event reports linked to ephedra, from heart palpitations to strokes to actual other deaths that were not highly publicized. And there's a specific report by the Rand Corporation, and that was kind of the nail in the proverbial coffin, where they had analyzed the data and concluded that while ephedra caused short-term weight loss, and had some potential benefits clinically, and it was actually well studied, and you'll be surprised by some of the names of the work that was on this, Trex. But
Well, I was
they
just gonna
concluded,
say. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, so they concluded that the benefits of ephedrine did not outweigh the significant cardiovascular and potential psychiatric risks, and the legal justification was primarily actually based upon that when they decided to, importantly, like you said, the FDA banned the sale of ephedrine alkaloids in dietary supplements. But ephedrine was not actually made a controlled drug. It was still available and still is available as a over the counter, but for other reasons that we're going to get into in a moment, like a behind the counter and monitored drug that you can just go into a pharmacy and purchase. So it's still a pharmaceutical drug, which I think is important to acknowledge, because the evidence did not support that in appropriate doses that it was dangerous. But the issue is that much like many dietary supplements, you're not necessarily buying ephedrine like in its pure form. It is like because it is present in plants. It's kind of like you can get yohimbine bark, which we'll talk about, to try to get to a certain amount of yohimbine. And depending upon how well the standardized process is, and again, these are not pharmaceutical companies, they're supplement companies, and how many corners they're cutting and the manufacturing details, you can end up taking way more or way less, neither one you want, than intended. And that was probably happening with the ephedra products. So, yeah, to your point, ephedrine never got criminalized to the same degree as steroids or prohormones, and it never got entirely banned, but it did get WADA banned. It is banned by most natural bodybuilding organizations, although that it's in a nebulous area there on how long you have to be off and even how well that was publicized. And there's a pretty unique there's some story there too that I want to tell you about, Trex. But yeah, ephedra didn't get the hammer quite as hard as steroids and prohormones, arguably for good reason, because it is really the dose that makes the poison, if you will, for a lot of the events related to ephedrine. But also, it is like when it goes bad, it goes bad.
Yeah, yeah. I interjected there, and I wanted you to finish your thought, but it's kind of insane to me that we think of like fitness and dietary supplements as being this weird little corner of the world that we engage in, that generally is kind of outside the view of broader society. But like when you brought up the Rand Corporation for being commissioned to do that report, like I was watching a documentary not too long ago about nuclear war and like the Cold War era. And like it was like, dude, when the U.S. government wanted to kind of project out, like, okay, so let's say that the Soviet Union does this and we do that, they would hire in the Rand Corporation to essentially forecast out how many hundreds of thousands or millions of deaths happened in scenario A, B, C, and D. So like
Yeah.
it's just it always blows my mind to think about this weird little supplement industry, and all of a sudden we've got the U.S. Congress and the Rand Corporation involved, and you're like, whoa, this is like real stuff. And one thing I do want to clarify here. So we've talked a little bit about Ephedra and Ephedrine. So as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, ephedrine alkaloids are found in ephedra-based products. And I believe for a time, and that time may still be today, when ephedrine alkaloids were banned in terms of being sold as dietary supplements, you still found for a while ephedra products that did not have those alkaloids in them. Is that still something you find on the market?
Absolutely. So ephedra is a plant.
Yeah.
Ephedrine is the chemical compound that is extracted from it that has the effect. And ephedra was not banned, but it had been so closely associated with the thing that absolutely supplement companies were like, "That's fine. We can just sell grass to you."
Right,
You
because it
know,
doesn't do
and
anything. Yeah.
correct. And honestly, that stuff is still out there, and it's not illegal. It's just shady marketing practices. And because most supplements anyway say like, listen, these claims haven't been investigated, we're not saying anything, but people say this could burn fat. It's just as problematic as it was previously, but it
Yeah.
is not fundamentally different. It's just shady marketing, and
Yeah.
that's essentially like, if you go to like gas station ephedra, and you have products that are listed as ephedra, and you can get them. They're often that they don't actually have ephedrine alkaloids, but you can go to the pharmacy, you can get Sudafed, right, and you have to go behind the counter, and to your point, you're like, we think that we're in this little insular corner of the community. But I think sometimes we forget that these compounds and what they're related to have bigger implications. So you can make meth from ephedrine. It's part of the like the
You keep saying
process. Like
you
if you're
can. Let's adjust that. Let's say
one
one could.
one
Yeah, because
one could
this is not a
hypothetically
Dr. Helms
make meth.
recommendation.
You should make meth from yeah. So um absolutely there are other things going on here. And again, when I share with you some of the research and the names on it, you're going to be like, "Oh shit, that's what they did early in their career." But the the thing is that ephedrine today is available. You can get it in Primatene, in like asthma medication, and you can get it in pseudoephedrine form in cold medicine, like Sudafed. And these are, regulated as drugs that are behind the counter. And the reason they're behind the counter, and what that means in many countries, including the U.S., is that because they can be used in the chemical process to actually make methamphetamines, there is a limit to how much you can buy, or how much you can buy before they record your name, or the pharmacist is required to talk to you about it, ask you about it, and take a picture of your ID. It depends upon the state. That's the way the U.S. works. And they have to send reports to government agencies because they are trying to limit the access of people who are going to make, methamphetamines, right? So even though people aren't worried about, well, hey, how do I extend the fat burning effects of the ECA stack and get a better boost to thermogenesis, they have a watchful eye on them for other reasons, and it isn't just the GLP GIP-1 phase that we're in now, where there was a heavy scrutiny of how can we curb the obesity epidemic and what drugs and pharmaceutical options are available. I mean, we've had like fen and all kinds of stuff that are related to some of these compounds going all the way back. And the ECA stack was one of the research potential options that was being considered in clinical weight loss trials, and potentially looking at ways of doing something with this. And that's why it was so common in supplements. And you know, this is not the first, nor will it be the last instance of it. So the obesity epidemic was really starting to take off, and you started to see the messaging around this in the 80s and 90s, around this time where we started to get all of the constellation of environmental effects of hyperpalatable, cheaper food, fast food, more things that enabled us to move less, like home appliances and office work. All that stuff was starting to hit its peak in the 80s, and then the internet comes out in the 90s. It only gets worse, right? So this is just, I'm going to say something ironic and intentional, pun intended. What we're seeing today is just kind of the same thing we saw in the 80s and 90s on steroids. So that's why it's not just this little corner of people who are, you know, on bodyrecomposition.com or in the 80s buying Dan Duchesne's Underground Steroid Handbook who know about this, but it was Rand Corporation, Congress, baseball, and like R1 research universities. Like there was some big players involved in this for these reasons.
Yeah, and
So,
just like
yeah.
a quick aside, so obviously people would take it for potential fat loss effects. Did people also take it just as like a general like performance enhancing stimulant as well, or was it always kind of pigeonholed as fat loss specifically?
No, this was a little before the full-blown pre-workout era, and probably a good thing because I think if this hadn't happened, ephedrine would be in pre-workouts. But it was absolutely taken by some of these baseball players and football players, not because they were trying to get leaner, but for energy and as a
Yeah.
stimulant. So it
Okay.
was very clearly like seen as a stimulant, and the reason you see it at gas stations is like this trucker wants to stay up, anything we can do, 24-hour energy type of thing. It was like in the pre-modern era of energy supplement category.
Yeah.
So I would say it was marketed as a stimulant along with caffeine as well as a fat loss agent.
Yeah, and I've heard stories from these are obviously anecdotes. I wasn't there. I wasn't born, which was a huge obstacle for me in terms of getting there. But I've
Yep.
heard former NFL players talk about how back in the day, and I think the day in this case would have been 70s and 80s, in a NFL locker room. So if you go into an NFL locker room these days, it's almost like a health spa. You're going to have like the area where they're making, what are those pressed sandwiches, the little paninis to order and smoothies. And there's, grab these bars and these drinks and those drinks. There's the hot tubs, the cold tubs, the whole deal, right? Obviously, it's a very professional looking setup these days. I've heard NFL players in interviews talk about back in the 70s and 80s, and there would just be these big old bowls in the middle of the locker room. And you would say, "Oh, what are these hard candies or Skittles doing out here?" And they're like, "No, this bowl is the oral anabolics. That bowl is the narcotic painkillers, and that bowl is the stimulants." And there was no record keeping of who was taking what. It was just, hey, you want it, it's there. Do what you got to do. So it doesn't surprise me in the least, that there could have been some really high dose usage of the ECA stack in the NFL in that kind of 90s era.
Trex, I will take a divergence for a second related to the history of anabolics and the modern incorrect perception of the advancement of PEDs, and do not let me go down a rabbit hole too far.
Okay.
But I'll say this: there's a current belief that over time, PED use and avoidance of detection of doping is getting worse and worse and worse, more and more sophisticated, and athletes are breaking more and more records because of the improvement in these drugs and the frequency at which they're taken. And the doping agency WADA just can't keep up. And haven't you seen Icarus? And Lance Armstrong didn't get caught. Yada yada yada. There's a that is just not true. The reality is that the vast majority of the advancements in anabolic steroids were done by the 60s. And they had made so many different combinations of androgenic anabolic steroids, leveraging different ways of doing it. That was where the P in PEDs was finished. We're talking the 60s, right? Um, and maybe into the 70s. And man, and it's just how do we get this to market? What can we get approved? And then boom, we get this stuff in the 80s and 90s, legally controlled, drug testing starts, research goes away, and everything since then has been about how can we sneak past detection, not make these drugs better.
Yeah.
But they only needed to start getting past detection in the late 80s, early 90s, and more seriously in the 2000s. And there was a period where they weren't full-blown controlled substances, but they were heavily available. Stimulants, I mean, and stimulants, even though they were more scheduled, there was still no testing in sport to any kind of systematic degree, to where the culture of use in professional sport was mind blowing. And you could go to not even professional sport. I think there was one survey of shot putters, throwers in the Olympics, 1 year in the Olympics, and all of them said, yes, I am using anabolic steroids. And there have been efforts in really interesting ways of basically just trying to get rid of the records from that era. So the IWF, and I think it's really got to stop doing this because it's causing issues now, changes their weight classes with relative frequency as they go through eras where the sport collectively decides, no, there was too much doping. And the first motivations to change their weight classes was to wipe the records that existed during this era where everyone was taking everything. And so when we look at track and field, weightlifting, powerlifting, even the IPF, we see it today as a bullish, super self-righteous, everybody's got to be clean. We're very consistent. This is your drug-free, powerlifting federation. Just listen to interviews with Ed Cohn and some of those guys back in the day. It wasn't like that. It was a tested rather than a natural fed in a certain era. And that all changed drastically in the 90s and later as culture changed, testing changed. And I know this tangent's going too long, but in modern era, we have people who are definitely doping, but they're taking small amounts for limited periods of less effective drugs, the emphasis being what can I get away with without getting caught, rather than let me just take friggin' everything because there is no testing. And some records in, certain sports are still have not been broken, or an era they were much more common, even though there was, a couple billion less people on the planet and far less participation than today for that reason. So I think that's just something people miss. And in modern sport, there is also a big difference, and there has been a huge cleanup in the last 10 years. We're probably in the cleanest era of drug testing right now, and a huge part of that is retrospective testing, which, it like you can say what you want about athletes are willing to do anything. They'll die to get that gold medal. They also want a legacy. And things have been really changing, and I think the cleanliness of sport right now would actually surprise people if they really knew what was going on. And I'm going to leave it there.
Okay, but one little cherry on top. There was a viral like TikTok video going around, and it's viral if it got to me because I don't have TikTok. But it was it's so funny. It's going through, I believe it was the 1980 Penn State offensive line. Like, like on a television broadcast, it would show them, oh, he's a senior from Falls, Pennsylvania. These guys in 1980 that were playing offensive line, if you just show me the lineup of people, I would have assumed that the median age was 46. And the median age was actually like 21. And so that is, I'm not making any accusations. I have no knowledge, Helms, but at a time where things were a little freer on the anabolic side, these people looked like they had aged about 15 extra years and also happened to have necks that, like, I mean, these were some broad gentlemen who also looked about 16 years older than they actually were. It's a very comical TikTok, even if it's just happenstance, and maybe my mind's playing tricks on me because of the style. You see someone who looks like they're in the 80s, they look older because of those things. But you should check it out just for the heck of it, because I promise you one thing: walk around a college campus, as I do daily, they don't look like that anymore. They really do not.
They do not, and I think we're starting to see higher performance in some of these sports now just because there is more people participating.
Yeah.
And it's taken a couple decades to kind of catch back up to the more common enhanced usage and free, like whatever you want,
Yeah. But
so anyway.
Needless, the moral of the story is when I go to work every day, I don't have any trouble telling who is the dean of the college and who's the offensive lineman on our football team. In 1980, I don't know. It would have been tough.
Especially if that dean was a fan of the weight room. you know,
Absolutely. Yeah, that
because you can
that
just
would be
get
the only thing is
off-label prescription use of anabolic steroids by asking your doctor, like, "Hey, I've been lifting. I'd like to get a little more gains.
yeah.
Can you just write me a script?" Sure.
Yeah, the only way you could tell is who has a 21-inch neck. That's the only telltale sign. Yeah.
That's right. All right, so we're back on topic. We're back on the ECA stack. I found it really telling that you had forgotten the A, what it stood for, and Lauren was not aware of the mechanism there. And I think it's because it is very much a tool to enhance the others. And there was research on this. So I think it's cool. I want to follow the thread. I said if if you saw some of the researchers on these papers in the 80s, you might be surprised. So Trex, when I say Delu, what type of research do you think of?
When I hear Delu, I'm thinking of my guy Abdul, who does all the
Hmm.
weight regain research.
That's right. A.G. Delu. You probably think of him from the perspective of metabolic adaptation
Yeah.
and characterizing a lot of these things. But his research that he was involved in the 80s was actually specifically on the ECA stack. So there's a paper, 1986, the thermogenic properties of ephedrine methylxanthine mixtures human studies. And there's another one called animal studies. Lead author Delu, second author D.S. Miller. Based upon the timeline, this almost makes me think, and I couldn't find record of this, I tried to hunt it down, that Delu might have actually done their PhD or maybe their master's specifically on like the ECA stack.
Hmm.
And I'm not claiming that, but based on the timeline, that's what I think may be the case.
Yeah.
So these studies are really interesting, and there's another great paper led by Daly, and it's called Ephedrine, Caffeine, and Aspirin: Safety, Efficacy for Treatment of Human Obesity, and it is specifically looking at the combination of these three compounds. So what essentially became kind of the bodybuilding go-to, and you're just combining aspirin with like hydroxycut. Um, was something that was being researched for clinical applications. And there was a tremendous amount of animal research. They did a lot in modified mice. And if you just look at the human studies, there's a handful of research that went on in the 80s and 90s that specifically looked at this. And a really kind of interesting set of mechanisms at play that I really appreciate this research because they looked at it from mechanistically what's going on. If we actually look at the cell, let's see this in animal studies, let's see this in human studies, and then let's actually take this into practice. So this was a relatively robust chain of research. It's hard to dig into and find some of the full papers from the stuff in the 80s and 90s. But to paint with broad brushstrokes, each one of these components to the ECA stack plays a unique role. So what you're looking at is essentially what is the powerhouse, what is extending its activity, and what is preventing some of the natural quote unquote breaks that go on in the fat cell when a great deal of energy expenditure and specifically lipolysis occurs. So, Trex, I don't know, we started to talk about stubborn fat a little bit, and then we kind of got onto a tangent. Do you think it's worth talking about some of the fat physiology? Do you want to go into that, or should we just kind of keep it high
Um,
level and get there when we get to the yohimbine?
Only to the extent that it kind of helps us understand the mechanisms at play here.
Okay.
You could touch on
Okay.
them. Yeah.
Well, you know what? You jump in as you feel needed, and I'll keep it on point because I know we're almost already an hour in. But the two stacks we're going to talk about, one is the ECA stack, ephedrine, caffeine, aspirin, and the other is a more targeted stack that is yohimbine, caffeine, and aspirin, which is I'm going to say it's used still by natural bodybuilders today because yohimbine is not banned. Ephedrine is. But it was used by natural bodybuilders before ephedrine got banned, which happened, like I said, in the mid 2000s. And the WADA list and the natural bodybuilding list don't always perfectly align because bodybuilding is its own unique animal, and aesthetic drugs and performance enhancing drugs don't perfectly cross over. And so, sometimes what you'll see is the bodybuilding banned substance lists are a little ahead of the curve on certain things, and they're a little less like bullish on others. So the example of ephedrine was that once it got banned and the WADA took care to look at it, and it was seen for what it was being used for in the bodybuilding community, it's like, okay, now that this is actually banned in other sports, this isn't really considered natural, so there's a cultural component here. We're going to ban it, but only for the last 6 months before use in some organizations. Like, for example, I believe the INBA, I'm not sure if it is still that way today, in the mid 2000s made a decision of saying, hey, ephedrine's banned during contest prep, essentially. But if you want to use this for some reason in the off season, go for it. And Philip Ricardo Jr., and I have a tremendous amount of respect for this man. He is a legend. He is one of the GOATs. And I'm not saying this to disparage him. It's public knowledge, but just kind of people forgot about it. I think it was in the mid 2000s, he popped positive for ephedrine because he was taking it all the way up to the competition, and he just didn't get the memo. And he got a suspension rather than a lifetime ban. He wrote an apology letter. They posted it on naturalbodybuilding.com. And he basically said, hey, sorry guys, just I've been using this since the 90s when I first started competing, didn't think about it, didn't know it was banned. I should have paid attention. I've just been doing the same thing and I didn't notice the change last year. So he had to
Yeah.
take basically a year off from competing.
Yeah.
So I think that's just really interesting.
Honestly, you know, you could be a purist. There's nothing wrong with that. We're each entitled to our own opinions. But like when I hear somebody got popped with a doping violation, and I'm like, that bastard. And then you're like, what did they do? And it's like, oh, a stimulant. I'm like, dude, I don't care. Like I really just don't. Like in bodybuilding, it's like, did they get like this little marginal advantage? Like maybe, I guess, but like I gotta be honest. I just couldn't care less about a stimulant, and especially Helms. Like there have been these instances where people get popped for a stimulant in powerlifting, and then I really don't care, like at all.
You might. You might when I talk about the actual pretty surprisingly high magnitude of effect that ephedrine has. And this sounds like I'm trying to get people to start taking it, but there's the like the modern thing. Like if you look at through the halls of mass, dear watcher, most of the time we're poo pooing fat burners because they just don't do much.
Yeah,
That wasn't always the case. So the reason why there was a fair amount of research, and then the research stopped, it's because it got banned, right? So just like there's not a whole lot of steroid research after it got banned, a lot of the ephedrine research died with these decisions and these laws,
which
right?
really sucks because like that theoretically should be what research is for, is the stuff that we can't figure out on our own. Like it's really annoying. Like as a tangent, very briefly, is like as cannabis-based products became more and more accessible over the last decade or so, now people have all these
Yep.
questions about, well, what happens in this scenario? What about that scenario? It's like, I don't know. We like basically just put a moratorium on this more or less once we decided as a society we weren't into it. And now it's out there, and we just punted on the idea of learning about it for 40 years, which like what is the utility in that? It's nonsense.
Yeah. And it's a consistent issue we do have in research, the interaction with legality, and the fact that legality is not only informed by research. So it's a two-way street that is frustrating at times. I fully agree. But yeah, like I said, I actually really like how they had a pretty solid chain of research from mechanistic to animal to human trials on this, with not a tremendous amount of data in full, but enough for people to be writing reviews. And probably in the modern era, there would have been some systematic reviews, scoping reviews, and meta-analyses that were done. But, this is at a different time in the kind of nutrition and health space. But essentially, research from the 80s and 90s consistently showed that not only was ephedrine an effective thermogenic, increasing energy expenditure, but they had a really powerful synergistic effect, caffeine and ephedrine. Specifically, it was twice the increase in metabolic rate that you would see acutely in some studies when you would combine ephedrine and caffeine. And you and I know that the bump in energy expenditure from caffeine is both transient, not that large, and typically doesn't eventuate into changes in actual body composition long term. And also the appetite blunting effects of caffeine seem to be transient, and also they just don't amount to much, even at relatively high doses. That is not the case when you looked at the EC and the ECA stack. You would see in the short term large increases. We're talking 8-9% in energy expenditure, And there was a clinical trial that found ECA produced a modest but significant sustained weight loss to a greater deal than placebo, uh, even without a prescribed diet. So when you give it to people and you're not even necessarily attempting to put them on a weight loss diet, what we saw in this one study led by Daly, using the ECA stack, over 8 weeks, the ECA group lost 2.2 kilograms while placebo lost zero point 0.7. So, even though you're not on a weight loss prescribed diet, when you know you're going into a study and you're someone with obesity, the BMI 37 average in this study, they're probably know they're being watched. It's kind of like when you start tracking, you tend to just go into a deficit just because do I really want to track this donut at work? So that's threefold more fat loss of people who are being, cautious, and obviously in a deficit or they wouldn't have lost zero point 0.7 kilos over 8 weeks, but a small deficit. That's less than 100 grams of weight loss per week, right? Or slightly more, sorry. But 2.2 kilograms, that's not nothing without actually trying to lose weight. And they did that as like an unblinded crossover to see how that went both times. And it's not the only study like that. There are several that suggest this. Some of them look at the postprandial increase in energy expenditure, which tends to be higher with the combination of ephedrine and caffeine. Some look at weight loss in animals, which of course is always more. And some also look at appetite blunting, which seems to be part of that mechanism as well. And people anecdotally reported that ephedrine seemed to really blunt some of their appetite. So yeah, the typical doses we're looking at, people were taking like 30 milligrams of ephedrine, 300 milligrams of aspirin, and your kind of 200 to 300 milligram doses of caffeine, and or even higher doses, 75 to 150 milligrams of ephedrine, and 330 milligrams of caffeine, depending upon, 330 milligrams of aspirin and 150 milligrams of caffeine, either in divided or a single dose. And that seemed to be pretty effective in several of these studies. And you'd also get a ton of people posting about it on the burgeoning forums that started to come out in the 90s and the early 2000s. People were always running on bodybuilding.com back in the day, here's my ECA stack log, and talking about their fat loss. And they weren't even necessarily controlling calories. This was in the burgeoning if it fit your macros era as well. So this stuff seemed to work reasonably well, Trex.
So I'm going to do a brave thing on the internet, which is I'm not going to claim to be correct,
Okay.
nor am I going to claim to have a point. But I am going to dig my heels in and reassert that I still don't care. Because my whole thing with anti-doping is, especially like just viewing it through the lens of like bodybuilding, powerlifting, is, are you taking something that, makes this process marginally more tolerable, or are you getting to a place that I'm not allowed to get to? So for me, the thing is like with steroids, it's like, hey, I'm doing a natural bodybuilding show and I'm on stage with a fat-free mass index of 33.5. What are we doing here? I can't, there's nothing I'm going to be able to do, right? But if you tell me like, hey, Eric, you get to pick your poison. You get to either be hungry and sluggish, or you get to be wired on stimulants and feel like absolute shit. Because that's really kind of what the trade-off, because no one feels that great when they're just like going stimulant weeks and weeks on end, pushing their diet hard. So for me, that's kind of my perspective on why, like, I still think from it, if I were in an organization, like at a leadership position, I would say, hey, there's all these other, adverse events going on. We don't want this to be a race to the bottom of who can tolerate the most extreme ECA stack. So I get why it's banned, but that's just my personal bias, is like when I hear somebody we saw this in powerlifting back when they were banning DMAA and geranium root, and it's like somebody took their old pre-workout and got popped for geranium root for powerlifting. And I'm like, bro, yeah. I just could not be bothered to care about that. And then you see online people are talking about them like they're like they're a common criminal. They've betrayed the sport, and it's like, you just can't get me emotional about that, no matter how hard you try, Helms.
No, I think that's fair, and that's one of the reasons why I'm unconvinced that, like, some people will talk about how, what, we need lifetime bans in natural bodybuilding, which I think one really discourages a lot of people who, like, especially from this era, like myself, like if you used pro hormones for a very, very brief period that you got over the counter, and then forever you have to compete with people who are on full blown anabolic steroids,
Yeah.
or the current, like currently, so they have rules related to first time use of SARMs, and the very similar things with pro hormones, and similar thing with ephedrine. Like, okay, if you used it over this time period, or it's only banned in this window, because natural bodybuilding is also wants to open its door to people who don't know about it. And it was like, natural bodybuilding, it's grown a lot, and people have the internet now, but man, like, people didn't even know it existed, or they didn't know about the legitimate federations only 10, 15 years ago. So I look at it as, okay, has someone surpassed their natural limit with drugs, and now are they going to compete drug free? That I'm less comfortable with, just like you're saying.
Yeah, yeah.
You
I
know,
don't want to get the guy who
but the
did.
idea is that, exactly, no, because the idea is, I don't think people actually understand the mechanisms by which steroids can give you a quote unquote permanent advantage. It's the same mechanisms that we think we understand, but we're still uncovering about muscle memory.
Yeah.
Like, if you took you did one steroid cycle and barely lifted weights when you were 17, and you're still got 30 pounds of natural muscle to gain, you made what, like twice as fast progress for 16 weeks sometime, and then you lost the muscle and you regained it. There's no advantage there. You have to actually, so steroids don't have any permanent effect any more than weightlifting does. You can get back to the muscle mass you had previously. So if you got a crap ton of muscle, way more than is possible with steroids, if you were an IFBB pro, then yeah, I could see there being an issue. But even that is somewhat speculative, because to get to that point, especially if you're blasting highly androgenic drugs at certain times, we talked about this before. Not everyone, but many people who are in the high dose kind of, I was a huge 300-pound, competitor in the off season. Many of them don't have normal levels of testosterone permanently after that, and have to be on HRT, which you can't use in natural bodybuilding organizations. So I'm not necessarily convinced that walking around with low normal levels now, after at one time you had 10 kilograms more than your natural potential, nets to something better than what you would have if you just stayed drug free the whole time. And that's a unique scenario of someone who decided, I am going to be an IFBB pro, and then I'm going to try to become a WMBF pro 10 years from now, which I think is an exceedingly rare time anyway. But
Yeah.
yeah, this is a complete tangent,
Yeah.
but we're doing it.
So I am curious. You talked about how caffeine and ephedrine alkaloids, they have the synergistic effect where they are dramatically increasing energy expenditure and also curbing appetite. The one thing I think a lot of people are probably thinking or wondering, myself included, is mechanistically, how does aspirin fit into this whole mix?
That is kind of cool. So, and we'll talk about that, and then why yohimbine comes into it. But one thing I will say is that this, I'm going to try to convince you one more time that maybe you'd be concerned about this. One other thing that some clinical trials in obesity noted was that it seemed to also help with lean mass retention.
Okay, so
And
now you got my attention.
now, my belief here as to why this is working is it's not a true lean mass retention effect, because I'm not convinced by some of the postulated mechanisms. But when you can really shift the needle towards lipolysis, no pun intended, you almost by definition are sparing more lean mass when fuel substrate utilization changes that much and for long enough periods out of the day during a calorie deficit, because your body is just going to choose to use more fat rather than potential other substrates, be it glycogen or from your amino acid pool, which may be from lean tissue. And I think that's something that people don't acknowledge. Natural bodybuilders struggle to lose as much fat and from specific areas and what seems like stubborn fat towards the end of prep because of what is quote unquote stubborn fat. And I think I could get into some of the physiology of fat, and I may as I talk about yohimbine a bit. But the conceptual way of thinking of it is let's say that you, like many, many bodybuilders, hamstrings, glutes, and lower ab fat and lower back fat comes off at the very, very end, and you might be completely peeled in other areas of your body. It's not like your body is focusing on one, and then once that's gone, it's focusing on the other, and it loses fat from there, and it's all going to eventually go. That is true in practice, but actually what's happening is you are sort of more rate limited in some of these more quote unquote stubborn fat regions due to the ability to actually liberate and then the propensity to re-esterify and restore fat if you don't burn it all off through your day-to-day activity. So stubborn quote unquote fat is more difficult to mobilize the fat from in the first place. Some of that's related to blood flow. Some of it's related to the actual fat cell being a non-preferential source of energy that the body is going to pull from, and that it is also hungry and it gobbles up, triglyceride to get remade into adipose tissue there. So even though it might get mobilized early, later in the day, sometime postprandial period, it might go back. So yes, you will eventually lose it, but let's say that all of your quote unquote non-stubborn fat, it's out of a total of 100%, it's providing 80% of your fat loss. Stubborn fat's losing 20%. So it's going down. And now you're thinking, oh, well, once I'm only have stubborn fat left, no problem. Now that's going to provide 100%. But it's 100% is a lower absolute number. That's basically what we're talking about. So that means that your overall partitioning of what are you using to make up for your calorie deficit, yeah, all the fat you're mobilizing and losing is from your stubborn fat area, but that's not the only substrate you're using. Now you're using more glycogen, you're flattening out, and now you're at greater risk of muscle loss, and you're using more protein for fuel as well. That's something we see when you put very lean people on total starvation diets compared to the obese, as you see 2 to 3-fold higher rates of gluconeogenesis, turning carbohydrates into fuel, and you see 2 to 3 higher rates, turning specifically amino acids into other substrates, and amino acid use generally, like directly in the muscle. So you're more likely to lose muscle along with that fat. And unfortunately, sometimes you don't even look leaner, even though your fat mass has gone down. I mean, if you think about it, let's say you got a pound of fat on your glutes, you lose half that, but you also lose a pound or more because of the relative energy content of muscle mass in your glutes. Imagine now that not only has the proverbial water around this hill gone down to show more of it, oh, it's actually a mountain, but the hill is also going down. So your relative body fat percentage, if we were just like, okay, your body fat percentage of just your glutes is 10%, it might still be 10%, even though your overall fat mass on your body has decreased. And you see this in natural bodybuilding. Someone will look leaner, but they will also look smaller, and certain parts of their body got harder, but others just kind of look like they flattened out. And that's what you want to avoid. And one of the potential ways to do that is by trying to find a way to increase the rate limit on stubborn fat. Now, the ECA stack doesn't do that specifically, but it does elevate the overall ability to use fat for fuel and to enhance lipolysis. So the engine is essentially caffeine and ephedrine and their synergistic effects that just raises overall energy expenditure. Now, Trex, you and I know this, that there are many feedback mechanisms in the body, and the body is always seeking homeostasis. And one of the things that occurs when you are liberating a lot of stored fuel from adipose tissue or increasing metabolic rate is that it starts to enact some of these feedback loops. And one of the ways that occurs is by elevating prostaglandins, specifically PGE2, which is a unique prostaglandin which essentially puts the brakes on lipolysis in the cell. It doesn't put the brakes on overall energy expenditure, but it essentially serves to shift your RER, right? So what is going on there is in a proportionate degree to which there is a signal to the cell to liberate energy as well as specifically fat for fuel, it will now start to ramp up the processes by which more prostaglandins are produced, which you might have heard of because they are related to the inflammatory process. You might have heard of NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, of which aspirin is one of them. Um, and that, when it rises, basically says, hey, listen, I don't want to keep using this much fat from this cell. I would prefer you to start using other substrates, less shifted towards carbohydrate and maybe amino acids a little bit. And this is where aspirin comes in. And this is kind of the aspirin is like almost the unsung hero. People don't really often know what it's for or why it's there. But if this is a prostaglandin generation and mediated effect, and if NSAIDs work to reduce inflammation and reduce pain by acting as COX-2 inhibitors, inhibiting the production of prostaglandins, they essentially serve as to remove the brakes on the fat cell so that you can keep mobilizing more fat from it and maintain a higher proportion of your energy expenditure from fat. So that is the aspirin angle. That is essentially what aspirin is doing. It produces, it enables the fat cell to continue to produce more and more energy from fat for a longer period, basically extending the fat burning effects from the cell. And there's more to it than that as well, because you would wonder, well, why aren't people using maybe a more powerful COX-2 inhibitor, something like ibuprofen or other NSAIDs? Why is it specifically aspirin? And that is something that I think is also worth talking about. But essentially, there is a pretty cool effect that salicylate, the active ingredient in aspirin, unlike other NSAIDs, has some other effects which are still being discovered and potentially even being researched now. But the main thing it does, among other things, which we'll talk about, is it reduces CAMP, cyclic AMP. So CAMP enhances lipolysis. Fat cells produce prostaglandins as a negative feedback loop in response to the degree of lipolysis signaling they received, in relation to the amount of stimulation, which is quite high from ephedrine and caffeine. And the greater that enhanced stimulation and liberation of adipose tissue from the cell, more lipolysis, there's a proportion increase in prostaglandins. So by inhibiting prostaglandin production, aspirin is thought to maintain higher CAMP levels, ensuring that cell utilization, fuel, stays shifted towards fat burning and for longer. So that's the main reason and the mechanistic explanation for why the ECA stack seemed to be better than any one of the compounds on their own. And it was what was primarily focused on for all the research into the 80s, 90s. And it has only been in the last few years that a specific additional mechanistic action of salicylate has been identified. And that is specifically that it might uniquely activate AMPK, which further increases fat oxidation and also inhibits fat restorage, which may be uniquely helpful if you're trying to target stubborn fat, like if you're using the YCA stack, which we can talk about. So, Trex, did I go too deep on the mechanisms? Was it too cursory?
No,
What do you think?
no, I think that's the right amount of depth. And, so we've got, this combined effect of elevating metabolic rate. Then we've got the aspirin component, which is allowing us to kind of facilitate this ongoing process of lipolysis. So that all makes sense. I think while people are still kind of locked into this mechanistic talk, maybe it is a good time to address the YCA stack, where instead of ephedrine, we're seeing yohimbine enter the mix. And I'm assuming that this was a swap that occurred after ephedrine got banned, or were these both kind of dueling it out in parallel, where when people were kind of doing one or the other?
Or even
Or
the crazy pharmaceutical nuts who would take the ECYA stack and just kind of go crazy with it, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it might be worth just I know one what about question that I and others would probably have when you hear this is, hey, I heard taking NSAIDs can blunt hypertrophy,
Yeah.
and is that an issue, right? And I think that is worth addressing. Yes, chronic use of NSAIDs, especially high doses, in certain populations, do seem to blunt hypertrophy, the response to resistance training. However, there is one specific study, I think by Lilja, and we covered this in mass, where what they compared it to was a lowish moderate dose of aspirin. I want to say it was 80 or maybe 75 or 100 milligrams. I don't have it off the top of my head. And it was compared to high dose ibuprofen. And it was actually the ibuprofen which had a reduced hypertrophy response to training from taking it regularly. So this is A, dose dependent, and B, it's only been shown to my knowledge with ibuprofen. So there may be some different effects of different types of NSAIDs. It's probably dose dependent. And again, it's going to be competing with the idea of, okay, is this blunting hypertrophy? And is that to a greater degree than it's potentially sparing and having an anti-catabolic effect because it's shifting more of your fuel utilization in a deficit to fat loss. So there's a couple different components there that I think are worth bringing up.
Yeah, and to your point, a lot of the stuff showing like blunted hypertrophy, just to reiterate, it generally does tend to be the highest dose that you'll ever see recommended, and it does tend to be ibuprofen. It tends to be that kind of paradigm. And the lower dose NSAID stuff doesn't look nearly as troubling to the hypertrophy aficionado as the, kind of the more moderate dose that you're more likely to actually take on a regular basis. You may do the high dose stuff when you have an acute issue you're dealing with, but you're doing it for 4 days. Who cares? I do think that the concerns as it pertains to lower dose NSAIDs are probably a little bit overstated in my opinion. And one thing I just want to mention as an aside is it blows my mind the extent to which, and I don't say this as like a fear monger because I use these medications regularly and I don't shy away from it at all. And in fact, my wife, she kind of grew up in a house where you don't just like automatically reach for pills every time you have a problem. My mother was a pharmacy technician, so we did. So, when I was growing up, if you had a headache, you take a Tylenol. Like it's not that big a deal, But I know there's a lot of folks who, they come up in a different kind of background, and they're like, oh, only if I had a severe migraine would I bother to go to the drug cabinet. But all that is to say, like I'm not at all skittish about using, over-the-counter medications, but it does blow my mind a little bit how we still are kind of trying to unravel some pretty basic questions about what they do and the extent to which they do it in the body. Like, it's too big a tangent for now, but there's still like a lot of vigorous debate and questioning and hypothesis generation about exactly how and why Tylenol blunts pain. Like Tylenol is very much an enigma when you start digging into the research, but too much of a tangent. It's just something I find interesting. Go ahead, take it away.
I think it's worth talking about it a little bit. So I'll say two things. And people might also hear, oh, AMPK, doesn't that directly counter mTOR? I think people forget there's a huge dose response thing here, and there's time course things that need to be considered. So really, I think it's worth looking at not just the mechanism, but also looking at the outcome, because you have to check your kind of your math here, and the data is interesting. Like the kind of dosages that are often recommended of aspirin use in these stacks, it's either high or kind of like the baby aspirin, like 80 milligrams, 100 milligrams range. And I think in the lower ranges of aspirin, it's been shown to be effective in the ECA stack, or even combined with just caffeine or just ephedrine, the aspirin. So you probably don't need to go really, really high. And while we don't have data to suggest that high dose aspirin is problematic, we do have data showing that low dose aspirin is not. And interestingly enough, there was a follow-up study to Lilja that was done in elderly adults where ibuprofen actually enhanced the response to resistance training, and at the same dose and in the same time frame. And the idea is that it really has to depend with the right amount of inflammation, because as always the case, cortisol equals bad, inflammation equals bad, rather than, hey, inflammation is a key critical process in the body. There's an appropriate amount. There's an inappropriately low amount. There's an inappropriately high amount. And in different clinical populations or just age groups, you're going to see different levels. So the typical amount of inflammation in a previously sedentary elderly group of people apparently is high enough to the point where it is actually making them have less gains from resistance training. And ibuprofen at the same dose, which blunts hypertrophy to some degree in young people, might actually deblunt it, if you will, in older individuals. So there is more to this than just kind of any simple thing like, is this good or bad, or is the net effect good or bad? But yeah, aspirin, we're still discovering its effect. There was a paper that was published just last month, or sorry, 2 months ago now, in June. A nitroalkaline derivative of salicylate, SANA, produces creatine-dependent thermogenesis and promotes weight loss. So there's been some big clinical trials that are looking at a modified version of salicylate, that's the main compound in aspirin, as a fat loss agent. And so there might be some independent effects of aspirin. I'm not saying in the form of aspirin. Obviously, this is a novel form of it, that it is just as effective. And obviously, pharmaceutical companies are looking at modifying this further. But the way they did it and how it was used, and the fact that it is independently having effects here, is kind of interesting. And it's supposedly doing this by messing with uncoupling protein 1, which I know you've written about when you were doing metabolic adaptation work, and AMPK activity. So similar mechanism, but just kind of dialed up. And when you look at the different groups in this paper, the ones that are on like the combined ascending highest dose of this novel version of aspirin, they're getting comparable weight loss to some of the GLP-1 drugs, which I think is wild, just to put that out there.
That is pretty insane. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we
Yohimbine.
were on the edge of our seat figuring out how yohimbine fits into this whole mix.
Absolutely. Okay. So I've been talking about feedback loops, brakes and gas, and there's more than one. Physiology is complex. So yohimbine is also another plant. I believe it's native in Africa, and the bark of the yohimbine tree has yohimbine alkaloids in it, which have specific effects. And your fat cells, like I said, they have gas pedals. They also have brakes. One of those brakes are what's called the alpha-2 receptor. And yohimbine acts as a alpha-2 antagonist, which just means that it basically puts the brakes on the brakes or blocks that specific brake from occurring. So yohimbine acts to further extend the fat burning effects, specifically in certain fat cells that have a lot of these alpha-2 receptors, which, going back to what makes stubborn fat, they have more of these, right? They have much more active alpha-2 receptors. So when you can block the alpha-2 receptor from putting the brake on fat loss in a fat cell, now all of a sudden it's mimicking basically non-stubborn fat. And I was talking earlier about how, okay, maybe I'm rate limited at how much I can lose from the fat in those areas. The idea here is that yohimbine takes off those brakes, and it makes it more like a typical quote-unquote fat cell. So it's not a hammer like the ECA stack is. The YCA stack is more like, it's like a scalpel. And there's not as much research on yohimbine, believe it or not, as there is on ephedrine or caffeine. And that's for another reason. So there's downsides to high-dose ephedra. We talked about the RAND report, 16,000 adverse events, some high-profile deaths. Yohimbine absolutely is not killing people. I haven't seen that. But the effective dose is also effective at producing side effects. There are notable studies that mention that yohimbine can induce anxiety. Not in everyone, not to a huge degree, but high-dose yohimbine is known to have cognitive effects and potentially influence anxiety. And that's not necessarily the same thing you want when you're 6 weeks out, worried about stubborn fat, and you're deciding to take something, and you're already a neurotic, bodybuilder. Having said that, anecdotally, I have seen that some people get no effect like this, and other people get some, and it's quite individual. And there is some good research on this. There was a study that was done in 2006 on soccer players that showed giving them yohimbine burned a fair amount more fat, and they lost a fair amount of body fat. That is the only, to my knowledge, human clinical trial, or I should say, controlled trial looking at yohimbine, though. So the research in humans is actually quite weak.
Yeah.
Now, the mechanistic research is not. And the interesting thing about the way you must use yohimbine is that insulin blunts its action almost entirely based upon the mechanistic research we have. So that means that there is a unique potential application of this, of doing it after you haven't eaten for a while, once insulin levels are low, because it basically won't do the thing you want it to. It's not going to be able to put the brakes on the brakes by acting on those alpha 2 receptors. So typically, where you might do this is taking it first thing in the morning, and you would do your traditional, like bit of fasted cardio, and it might be the one time fasted cardio could be more effective, or you would take it, say, before training as a pre-workout, and then not have a meal as close to training as you might normally. And it's an opportunity to ramp up energy expenditure. And if you're also taking aspirin and you're also taking caffeine and or ephedrine, you're going to be using a lot more fat for fuel and hopefully more of it from stubborn fat stores. Now, yohimbine is still a stimulant. I think that's worth noting. It has this other effect, puts the brakes on the brakes, but in and of itself, people do report stimulatory effects that are dose dependent. So it's not completely dissimilar from the ECA stack, but from a raw stimulant of feeling and from a raw increase in metabolic rate, it probably doesn't compare to ECA, because ECA can get you close to like a 10% increase while you're taking it to your energy expenditure and shifts things more towards lipolysis. And essentially adding Y to the mix just goes, oh, and by the way, those more stubborn fat cells are going to contribute and come to the party as well, but not if insulin's there. I have seen a lot of people who used to do the ECYA stack, and they would report like some pretty dramatic side effects. So I think that's worth saying. That was generally something people would advise against.
Yeah.
And Trex, to answer your question, you were like, hey, are people doing the ECYA, or is just this, oh, damn, ephedrine's not available, I'm going to do YCA? It became both.
Yeah.
So there was absolute, like a tested bodybuilder had no option after the mid 2000s. Ephedrine's banned. You can't use it. So it's YCA or just CA or just caffeine or just yohimbine, but
Yeah.
you're going to use it. It's a mild thermogenic, but it's a supposedly potent stubborn fat loss aid. But I will tell you, anecdotally, I haven't seen huge effects from it. It's something, but it's nothing to write home about. And the anecdotes from the ECA stack were a little more pronounced. That is for sure. Because, a 10% increase in metabolic rates is not nothing. And if you're doing that every day for 8 weeks, it just makes getting into a deficit a little easier. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Couple points on yohimbine. First of all, one thing that you glossed over in your modesty, or you're being a little bit shy tonight. If one were to take yohimbine, and if one were to be a male, you might want to keep an eye out for more activity below the belt. There is a fair amount of research on yohimbine as an aid for erectile function. And so there were some folks back in the day who had not planned for that particular effect, and felt like they were like like a 12-year-old boy again, and were like, what is happening to my body? So that's something to keep an eye out for. And there are many products that are marketed for improving sexual function and specific. You have to be really careful with supplements of not claiming to treat or manage any kind of disease, but they're essentially marketed as like, if you have erectile dysfunction, you might consider taking this to, support healthy sexual function, fill in the blank. But there is some research on that. So if one were to take it, keep an eye out for that. Don't be too surprised. Also, one thing.
I got two hilarious comments
Okay.
specifically on that.
Sure.
Can I jump in just for a second?
Of course.
So this is mechanistically interesting and also hilarious for people who understand the realities of bodybuilding. So yohimbine does enhance blood flow. And there are alpha 2 receptors in blood vessels as well. So it helps to like decrease blood flow restriction, if you will.
Yeah.
So that vasodilation is specifically why it can help with erections. And it's specifically why you will not find bodybuilders talking about that effect, is because they're specifically taking it at the point where libido is so tanked that it's not a mechanical issue with blood flow, but caring enough to
Yeah.
need there to be a reason to initiate the blood flow
Yeah. That is
to
true.
get an erection in the first place. So
Yeah.
it's a hilarious thing where if you see people in like the general population using yohimbine, absolutely, they will be surprised. They're like, "Whoa, I got something unexpected going on here."
Yeah.
You will find nary a male natural bodybuilder typically talking about that by the time they decide to use yohimbine, because yeah,
Yeah.
mechanically it would work, but they have no reason to be interested in that.
Right. Yeah. That is true. The other thing I wanted to mention is so we have another kind of terminology thing where there is yohimbe and yohimbine.
Yes.
So
Ephedra,
yohimbine,
ephedrine, yohimbe, yohimbine.
yeah.
Very
So
important.
yohimbine, generally we're talking about the actual active compound that is found in the bark of the yohimbe tree. So you will
Yes.
see, in some cases, you may even see some type of yohimbe extract, which if it doesn't have, standardization for a particular amount of yohimbine, you may end up again with the kind of ephedra with no ephedrine and saying, what am I even doing here? But that does bring me
Yes.
to a kind of set of related questions. So, what exactly is the status of the what's the regulatory status right now of yohimbine? Are you aware of any countries where it is impermissible as an over-the-counter supplement? Are you aware of any federations that ban it?
So it is not banned by any federations that I'm aware of, including WADA. It is only available, as I'm aware of, over the counter in the U.S. as a supplement, and almost every other place in most regulated places. I mean, there are some places where you can just get D-ball from a, like if you go to Mexico, you walk down the street, people are going to be offering you Winnie outside of the pharmacist. So there are some countries where the comparison is just a different environment altogether.
Yeah.
But in similar environments that are regulated and people actually seem to care, if we're talking Europe, if we're talking Australia, if we're talking Canada, I believe I haven't double checked Canada, but UK and New Zealand, you can't get yohimbine. So it is not banned. It is not illegal to use, but it cannot be sold in supplements because it is basically kind of the same way ephedrine is, right? That's probably the best comparison. So it actually was helpful that we talked earlier about how ephedrine isn't banned. You can get it in the pharmacy, but it is a pharmaceutical class drug, and that's the way yohimbine is in almost everywhere besides the U.S.
Yeah.
So it is something that
Makes you
could
appreciate your
technically
freedom even more, as a red-blooded
even more. Yes,
American.
sir. That's right.
Beautiful.
So yeah, so I think that that's really important. And I've said all this cool stuff. I've excited people. They're now probably more open to the idea of taking these things. But I
Yeah,
think
we're
there
reading
are some,
this transcript basically reads like a muscle magazine in 1986.
yeah, because that's kind of the history and where I saw it. But people are probably wondering what happened to the Helms who basically said never take anything except third party tested creatine and everything else is bunk. Guess what? He's not gone. He's still here, and
Okay.
I'm going to tell you why. So it's very important to acknowledge that if you want to use any of these, it should be third party tested, um, not only for the presence of potential banned substances, but also purity and quality. Because the tolerable upper level intakes of these drugs and the effective doses of these drugs, and I'll call them both drugs, yohimbine and ephedrine, because countries classify them that way. Yohimbine, not in the States, but everywhere else, is classified that way, are very close, uncomfortably close to one another. So the effective dose of yohimbine is typically zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.2 milligrams per kilogram. And importantly, the cheapest way to get this is to get it through yohimbe, the plant. Just like the cheapest way to get it back in the day was through ephedra, the plant. And a cheaper thing for a supplement company to do is to not get the highest quality plants with a standardized extract. You can get the straight up extract. You can be selling ephedrine in its alkaloid form, well, back when it was legal, just like you can get yohimbine HCl now, which is probably preferable. But it's more expensive to do that, and it's more expensive to get third-party testing. And if you're one of those companies that wants to have an effective product so people buy it and purchase it because it's hard to sneak past the placebo effect for a stimulant only going to get you so far. People can feel it. It's like trying to fake beta alanine. It's like, I'm not tingling. I don't think this is in there. So what you will sometimes get is supplement companies who are using the bark, but it's not a standardized dose. So you might accidentally be taking a much higher dose than you intended, and that can be frankly dangerous of either one of these. Like I said, 16,000 adverse effects in the land of ephedra prior to the regulation. Yohimbine, it's certainly not as dire. I am not aware of any deaths related to yohimbine, but I am absolutely aware of people having heart palpitations, being unable to sleep, being all of a sudden super surprised by the same product that they bought, one batch versus another, seeming to have no effect or a very large effect. So I
There is
cannot iterate enough. You need to get third-party testing on this, lab testing, and only buy from trusted manufacturers and supplement companies if you're going to dabble.
like you said, I'm not aware of any deaths, but there is research reporting a very high number of hospitalizations and calls to like poison
Yes.
control centers of like, I feel very, very wrong. I took this yohimbine, so 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think don't mess around with this stuff. And I also want to reiterate that this is still a supplement. Like an 8 or 9% boost in metabolic rate with the now largely unavailable and banned ECA stack it's something that's measurable that shows up in studies in the same way that creatine has an effect and shows up in studies. But in the same way of using creatine, you're not going to know. Like you might be able to notice a slight boost in performance or that your scale weight went up, but many of these things are ultimately what we would describe as trivial to small effects. They are real, but they are minor in the grand scheme, and you're not going to be able to jump on the ECA stack, not worry about your diet, and wake up one day and be like, oh shit, I guess I'm ready to get on the bodybuilding stage. I am diced, right? Um, so, and the same thing I will say with yohimbine. I'm not sure that everyone necessarily has as much stubborn fat as they think they do, and I don't think that's typically the barrier to people getting in shape. It is something that you might want to consider if you are someone who is not prone to anxiety, and if you find that when you even maintain a reasonable approach to trying to get down to the last little bits of stage condition, that it comes with a noticeable amount of loss of fullness and muscle mass. But I will tell you, as a coach and an athlete, 8 out of 10 times, I won't say nine, 8 out of 10 times when that's observed, it's because the person is also behind the eight ball, trying to lose weight too fast, or they kind of think in their head, look, this is just math. I can just do a 500 calorie deficit, lose the 3 more pounds I got to lose at the end, and I'm good. And it's no different to being in a 500 calorie deficit when I'm 20 weeks out. But that's not true. When you only have 3 pounds of metabolizable fat on your body, losing a pound a week is expecting to lose a third of the fat on your body every week. And when you have 15 pounds, it's a very different story. And over again, I've seen the anecdote hold up that you just can't rush getting into the final bits of stage condition. You can get to really close to stage condition, and then it's going to take almost just as long as it took to get from like beach lean to legally shredded, hints of glute striations, as it takes to get from glute striations to holy crap, that guy looks peeled out of his mind. Like, let's say we've got a 24-week diet, you might get what we would call quote unquote shredded in 18. The last 6 weeks is what it's going to take to get truly, truly diced. And you can't get there even though on paper you're like, oh, 3 more pounds to lose. Oh, no problem. 3 more weeks. Not going to work that way. It'll probably take twice or 3 times as long to do it without sacrificing a substantial amount of fullness or muscle loss. And yohimbine's not going to change that to where you can still do it in 3 weeks. You might be able to get it done in 6 instead of 8 or something like that.
Yeah.
So that is the degree of confidence I have in it. It's a minor effect. It is not even necessary for most people. And for many, It is an active net negative if you're experiencing some degree of this anxiety. And this is another anecdotal one, and I have no data to back this up, but some people also seem to look a little more blurry and watery, and they have some water retention when they take yohimbine. There may be a mechanism that I'm just not aware of, and it's something that you typically pull out the last week of prep anyway. So you can't use it the whole time. You probably shouldn't. If you're prone to anxiety, it's only going to get worse, and it's only going to do so much. So unless you have pretty pronounced stubborn fat, maybe do or don't use it. I have used it. I think I saw a difference, Trex.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
Are you going to use it this prep?
Well, here's the thing: is it's not available in New Zealand, so
Okay.
I would have to travel to the States, get it, bring it back. So yeah, there's a barrier there.
Yeah.
But I am just now starting to bring in, caffeine, and I am not doing it much higher than, because basically I don't actually take caffeine on its own. I just have coffee in the morning.
Yeah.
And now what I'm doing is actually taking a bit of caffeine and then just going from a double shot to a single shot in the Americano I have at breakfast. So yeah, we're getting to the point where I'm like, I could use a little pick me up as I go
Yeah.
from legally shredded to diced. But yeah,
Let me ask you this way. If you coached 100 bodybuilders over the next X amount of time, what percentage of them do you think you would suggest, hey, let's give this a shot?
well, I would never suggest a supplement. I would provide education about them.
Mm-hmm.
And if they decided to make that decision, or they asked me about it, which I would ask them to do before they pulled the trigger, I would give my educational perspective. And in maybe 10 to 20% of cases, I would say I think theoretically there's a potential use case here. Please consult, your doctor, because it is a stimulant. It does have these effects on the cardiorespiratory system, and make an informed decision about that. And it must be third party tested. It must be tested for purity if you're going to do it. And I would also ask that they be willing to put that genie back in the bottle if they start to experience more anxiety. And it would be specifically in the case of people where I'm like, man, we're struggling not to lose size, and there's a lot of fat in certain areas and very little in others. And that's not most athletes.
Beautiful. Cool. That makes sense. So we hit the mechanisms, we hit all the fun history, we hit the practical takeaways. Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up here?
No, I think we covered it all. And yeah, I'm sure we'll get some questions. Hopefully I didn't get any of my mechanisms wrong, kind of shooting from the hip. I'm sure I'll hear about it in the comments if I did. But yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I think most people will be surprised about the effect on camp that aspirin has, the new information on its effect on AMPK, and potentially even how it's still being investigated as a fat loss agent, even independent, but of course, modified and boosted up, which I think is really new and interesting information, because that's literally just come out a couple months ago.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I think this was a great episode. We didn't even really necessarily plan to dive that deep into it, but we did anyway. And sometimes it's nice to be spontaneous. So, yeah, hopefully people enjoyed it. I'm sure we'll get some questions. I do want to give some shout outs to people in the chat. I think I'm on the Mass Research Review chat right now. Greg Wazowski giving us a little shout out. Hey, Greg, how's it going? Mickey commenting on a little bit of humor that I dropped. Always the narcissism always enjoys a little bit of stoking, so I appreciate that. And the real reason I'm diving into the chat is because Philip M basically wrote some high quality marketing copy for the Mass Research Review in the comments. Philip is a lifetime subscriber, and I just wanted to tell Philip I really appreciate the kind words there. Philip also was reminiscing about the old days, remembering the hydroxycut pills. And one thing I wanted to mention when you were talking about it is, I swear, I feel like hydroxycut has faced, like, if memory serves, I could be completely fabricating these memories. I feel like they faced like 30 class action lawsuits, reformulated 170 times. That brand will not die. Like I need to go back and fact check. That is the case, right, Helms? You remember
Bro,
this?
dude, 16,000 adverse events. And as you recall, in the 2000s, Muscle Tech was easily the biggest supplement company in the
Oh
world. They
yeah.
had all the ads with the white coats. They had all the biggest IFBB pros signing contracts. You would be confused 3 pages into your Flex Fit Mag. Oh, this is an interesting study on the use of carbohydrate with creatine. Oh wait, this is a Cell Tech ad, and it became such a big thing that Dat Dare Cell Tech was a meme that has recently died off, but it was code for steroids because that was how it was marketed. But no, 100%. I guarantee you, if I had to guess, maybe 50 to 60% of the sales of all ephedrine related fat burners were hydroxycut, which means they were probably about 8,000 of those adverse events.
Yeah, it just kills me because I remember like being in the supplement world for a long time, and I would hear like, oh, Muscle Tech's going through all this litigation and all this other stuff, and they're going to reformulate, and I was like, well, it's the end of an era. No more. What was it called again? No more hydroxycut. And I swear, hydroxycut is going to exist well after I'm dead. There's no
Oh yeah.
chance I outlive this. They just
Yeah,
keep coming
hydroxycut
back.
for the last 20 years has not had ephedrine in it.
Yeah,
But,
they change it. They do what they got
it's
to
still
do.
out there. Yeah.
Yeah, props to them. All right, perseverance, Helms. That's what it's all about for a brand like that. All right, folks, appreciate you joining us. Our pleasure as always. Be sure to like, rate, subscribe, review, all that other stuff. If you really want to be a major, top tier, number one supporter, you can also become a member of the Mass community, and you can learn more about that at massresearchreview.com. Everybody take care. Have a fantastic week, and we will be back in 7 days.